Ideas and Insights provides a rich analytical framework for thinking about some of the most pressing issues of our time. Engaging, enlightening, bold, and original, Ideas and Insights offers new vistas for making sense of the world. Join us here on this channel. I am Badrinath Rao, your host for Ideas and Insights. Hello and welcome to Ideas and Insights. I am Badrinath Rao, your host for the program. I wish to begin this episode by posing a question. Have you lately been upset because someone treated you poorly? Do you harbor memories of when someone misbehaved with you or treated you with contempt, or belittled you and made unfair, uncharitable comments about you? We confront these situations every day. They hurt us, sometimes grievously. Often, we cannot put these insults behind us, no matter how hard we try. There is hardly anyone who cannot relate to what I am saying. Alienating conflicts are a fact of life. Discord and disagreements suck the breath out of our nostrils. I'm not talking about minor differences that crop up in interpersonal relationships. They are instructive. They help us understand others. I'm concerned about chronic, toxic disputes that dissipate our energies, diminish our human potential, and leave us enervated. Every instance of disharmony, from seemingly innocuous altercations to unyielding, lifelong, festering feuds, extracts a burdensome toll in terms of lost productivity, missed opportunities, and forfeited income. In addition, the psychological devastation it inflicts makes us withdrawn, cynical, and profoundly vulnerable. Corrosive relationships, thus, are pernicious. They frazzle mutual bonds and gnaw at the roots of social solidarity. What lends urgency to this issue is that we all have one life that is unidirectional and non-renewable. Thus, no one can afford to acquiesce in acrimonious and abusive relationships. If strained relationships are ruinous and a universal problem, why are we not addressing them on a war footing? Because most of us labor under the illusion that complicated relationships, big and small, are a fact of life. Like aging, death, or puberty, you take them in your stride and try to move on. Hence, barring perfunctory attempts to resolve disputes, we capitulate to their oppressive force and struggle in vain with the diffused animus they engender. Is it any wonder that we are all maladjusted to varying degrees? Our relationships are frayed. We feel beleaguered in a hostile world, overwhelmed by an unavailing sense of despondency. We echo Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher and literature, who said, "Hell is other people," in his play, No Exit. Suppose this describes your situation. Then, like most people, you're perhaps ignoring a pivotal element undergirding all conflicts, namely dignity, a point emphasized by Dr. Donna Hicks, an international expert on conflict resolution. An associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, Dr. Hicks is the author of 2 acclaimed books, Dignity, Its Essential Role in Resolving Conflicts, and Leading with Dignity: How to Create a Culture that Brings Out the Best in People. Yale University Press has published these books. With decades of experience in unofficial diplomatic efforts to solve conflicts in troubled regions such as Northern Ireland, the Middle East, Colombia, and Sri Lanka, Dr. Hicks offers a refreshingly original perspective on the root cause of all disputes. She posits that conflicts occur when we ignore or outrage people's dignity. Dr. Hicks defines dignity as an aspect of being human and a hallmark of our shared humanity. Dignity, according to her, is our inherent value and worth, something we all deserve no matter what we do. Dr. Hicks conceptualizes dignity as 3 C's: the consciousness that we are connected to our dignity, the dignity of others, and the dignity of something greater than ourselves. And she proposes a new model of dignity. Dr. Hicks highlights its 10 elements: acceptance of identity, recognition, acknowledgement, inclusion, safety, fairness, independence, understanding, the benefit of the doubt, and accountability. Failing to respect these elements of dignity, she avers, is one of the primary reasons why we have tense and tumultuous relationships. Dr. Hicks maintains that we can preempt crippling animosities if we consciously avoid what she calls the 10 temptations to violate dignity. She identifies them as taking the bait, saving face, shirking responsibility, depending on false dignity, maintaining false security, avoiding confrontation, assuming innocent victimhood, resisting feedback, blaming and shaming others, and gossiping and promoting false intimacy. One of the most effective strategies for insulating ourselves from the psychological trauma of embittered ties, Dr. Hicks says, is embracing the Mandela consciousness, the idea that dignity is in our hands alone and no one can take it from us. Besides, she points out imaginative measures like cultivating empathy, making it safe for people around us to be vulnerable, and creating a culture of dignity in our homes, communities, and workplaces will enable us to rediscover the alchemizing power of affirming, nurturing, and ennobling relationships. Dr. Hicks joins me now to discuss her thoughts on these topics. Welcome to Ideas and Insights, Dr. Hicks. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, Professor Rao, it is such an honor to be here with you and a pleasure to be sharing these ideas together. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Let's begin with the question of dignity. How did you arrive at this idea that dignity is the bedrock of all relationships?
Yeah, all conflicts in relationships, especially when they go bad. I was working for many, many years, as you pointed out, as a facilitator of dialogues for parties in conflicts. We started out in the Middle East, and then I did my own project in Sri Lanka for 10 years. And we basically worked in my program at Harvard. We worked all over the world, wherever there were these intractable conflicts. And we would be sitting down there with the parties, and I could tell so clearly, because I'm a psychologist, I could see that they were getting so upset, not so much about the content of the political issues, but I could see that they were getting so upset about the way the other side was treating them. And to make a very long story short, I finally said, hey, look, there's more than just politics that's separating these parties. There's a human dimension there. that people are responding to, and they're not even necessarily conscious of the depth of it. All they know is they hate being treated as if they didn't matter. And so, again, very long story short, I encourage the people to read the book to get the longer story. But the very long story short was that I realized that what people were reacting to was the way they were being treated by the other side, being treated as less than human, as if they had no dignity, as if dignity weren't even part of their human, consciousness. So once I figured that out, Professor Rao, I saw it everywhere. I saw it in the Middle East. I saw it in South Asia. I saw it in South America. I saw it in our own country with different conflicts. So it was really quite astonishing. I knew that I had to write about this concept of dignity, and that's what my first book was about. And it just touched a nerve everywhere. I was shocked that when Yale published that first book, I then got calls from the corporate world, from healthcare, from universities, from organizations of all kinds saying to me, I think you nailed our problem in our work environment. It's about their people's dignity, and they want to be treated as if they are something of value and worth.
It's a paradox, Dr. Hicks, is it not, that on the one hand, we now know a great deal about the importance of dignity in interpersonal relationships, but on the other, we are beginning to see that people's dignity is being violated again and again and again. What do you think accounts for this?
Well, here's the problem, and I've seen this everywhere in the world that I've gone to introduce this topic. This is something that's not a part of our educational system. Kids don't learn about each other's dignity. They should. Now they are. Now I've got teachers all over the world teaching this. But when we were growing up, and even when our children were growing up, there was nowhere to learn about this. Not in a way that showed people concretely what it looks like. You just mentioned all those 10 elements. Those things are what happens when if we are not treated fairly, or if we don't feel like we're included, or if we're treated as if we were less than because of something to do with our identity. So it's the ignorance, honestly, Dr. Rao. I think it's the ignorance and it's global ignorance. And slowly we are, my partners and all of my team we're getting into the educational system. As I said, we've got people all over the world now introducing dignity into the classroom. And I think the next generation, after they learn this, I think we're going to see a big difference in the way we think about what a relationship should feel like.
I really hope you are right. But I want to ask you a more fundamental question. What is it about dignity that its violation triggers such visceral reactions in people?
So here's the thing that I discovered. I felt that it was important for me. I'm a scholar. I'm a practitioner, but I'm a scholar too. I felt like I had to get some proof that what I was saying was actually happening. Because it's one thing for Donna Hicks to go around and say, oh, people get into conflicts because their dignity's been violated. But what I ended up finding and going into the literature on social neuroscience, and what I found there was evidence to show that when people feel and experience an assault to their dignity, what I call a dignity violation, that it shows up in the brain in the same area as a wound to their physical being, as a physical wound. So this is not something that is like a little touchy-feely, oh, be nice to people and all that. No, this is something deeper. And as you said in the intro, that intro was so beautiful that you did. As you said, goes to the heart. It's the hallmark of our shared humanity, this desire to be treated as if we mattered. And our bodies, like you said, there's a visceral reaction here. Our bodies respond as if our lives were on the line, but the fact is, psychologically, it's our dignity. And it has physical manifestations in our brain. You know, our brain doesn't know the difference between a wound to our dignity and a physical injury. So, I mean, just think about it. We have an entire legal system that protects us from being physically harmed. But we've got to develop this consciousness that says, hey, we cannot treat each other this way. And like you said earlier, insult each other and, you know, treat each other as if they're less than us, or whatever the harmful cognitive processing people are engaged in about other people. We are all equal, maybe not in status, maybe some people have more power than us, but the fact is we're equal in dignity. And not until we have that deeply embedded in our consciousness are we going to see, I think, appreciable change.
Early on in the book, you propose a new model of dignity and you outline its building blocks. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think you reviewed several of the building blocks. The first is the definition. Dignity is our inherent inborn value and worth. We all come into the world with dignity. There's no two ways about it. And you know, it's different from respect because people confuse these two things all the time. So I make it very clear what I think the first building block is understanding what dignity is and what it isn't. And the first part of that, as I just said, is that dignity is inborn. It's inherent. It's in all of us when we come into this world. I think respect, on the other hand, has to be earned. It's something that we do. If we do something special, people, you know, people respect us. They say, yeah, boy, that was amazing, that what you did, you know, whatever it is. And so that, just making that distinction first between dignity and respect. The second thing is understanding, like I just explained, the neuroscience of dignity, that this is something real. This is something that our bodies respond to. These insults, these, you know, violations of dignity, our brains are wired to react to it. And we have, you know, cortisol goes running through our body. We have these hormones that get released. It is a physical reaction as well as a psychological wound. So that's the second one. The third one are these 10 elements of dignity that you beautifully highlighted. And the fourth are the fourth building block are the 10 temptations to violate dignity, ways in which our evolutionary legacy has set us up to react in certain ways, like with that fight and flight instinct. But the fact is there are so many, and you went through that list of the taking the bait, shirking responsibility, saving face, and so on. And the reason why that is so important, Professor Rao, is because sometimes when we get into an argument, you know, with somebody, we go into that mode, into that temptation mode, and we start taking the bait, we start returning the harm, we think we're the innocent victim. And so knowing that, having an understanding that we are set up for defensive reaction, and it's self-preservation, and that's what gets triggered. But if we don't know that about ourselves as human beings, we're going to get caught up in all of that stuff. So we have to figure out how to control those reactions before they control us. And we are equipped. The last bit of this is about knowing and understanding how we can override those destructive reactions, self-preservation instincts that wreak havoc on relationships. And then there's the I and the me, finally, the I and the me. There's two parts of ourselves that we humans have, these two parts. The me is what I just described, the one that gets provoked and triggered by somebody who insults us or whatever. And those temptations, we get lured by those temptations, and our me, this part of ourself, is hyper reactive to them. Now the I, on the other hand, it's the part of us that has the capacity to reroute those reactions. We can stop those self-preservation instincts before they do harm. And we can make a choice about how we want to react. So those are the basic building blocks. And again, even kids, listen, you'd be so happy to hear that little third graders, that my teachers who are dignity teachers, they really understand how to get this across, in an age appropriate way. So kids are learning this. It's so exciting.
You have talked about a lot of things. Let's take them one by one. You draw your 10 elements of dignity from evolutionary psychology, you said. And I'm just curious to know how our evolution impacts our sense of dignity and security. Can you elaborate on that, please?
So it isn't the 10 elements, it's the 10 temptations that are rooted in our evolutionary past. The biologists tell us, and these evolutionary biologists know so much about these things. I was so excited to discover this entire literature. I never learned it as a graduate student. I never learned it anywhere. So in order to try to understand, why do humans, react so powerfully? Why do we even hurt people we love when we've been violated? And, what is it? So those instincts, those self-preservation instincts I was just talking about, they're part of our evolutionary past. They're part of the evolution of our species, of the human species. And now in the 21st century, as opposed to 200,000 years ago when these reactions evolved in our brains, now we have developed other parts of our brain. We have a neocortex that helps us stop those reactions before or at least stop them before they get really destructive. So fortunately, and again, this is all about understanding who we are as human beings. Without this understanding, we are likely to see the same kind of, conflicts that we're seeing today, we've seen in past history. We need this education.
You say, Dr. Hicks, that a lot of our tense relationships are the result of the contrary pulls of what you call individuation and integration. What do you mean by that?
I mean, I'm hoping I remember what I meant by that, but I think there is this struggle. There's a struggle that, and E.O. Wilson, if any of you are more interested in learning more about this process of individuation and integration, E.O. Wilson makes the claim that we humans are engaged in an internal struggle between the desire to individuate and become our own person, our own individual, and that we have all those self-preservation instincts that get triggered when we feel a threat coming on. But then we also have this equally as powerful desire that's hardwired into our brains to be connected with other people, to integrate into relationships, to be in a relationship with others. So it's this push and pull between wanting to protect ourselves as individuals, but yet at the same time become a part of and integrate with our loved ones, our community, all of that. So that's that big struggle. And E.O. Wilson is so funny. He says, if you think that your inner tension is something unique to you, he said, forget it. It's about being a human, because we have this push-pull inside us. All of us have it. So, and then he says, and humans, because of this tension between these two, the desire for individuation and the desire for connection with other people and integration, he said, we suffer from ruthless ambivalence. And, because a lot of times we are wondering, gee, do I really want to get close to this person? Well, is it going to be a threat to me? Am I going to be able to trust that person? We're going back and forth all the time as humans. And I laugh because I think he nailed it. I think he really nailed that internal tension that all of us have experienced in our lives.
You talk about something that really intrigued me. You say that ranking human worth can have pernicious consequences, and you refer to Robert Fuller's book, Somebody's and Nobody's, abusive ranking of people. Why do you think that ranking people in terms of their abilities is harmful?
Well, because then it's a setup for an abuse of power. And, whenever I give these talks, people always ask me about the power dynamics here. Mm-hmm. And if you have a notion in your head, let's say that you're from one of these old traditional leadership, styles where you really believe that command and control is the only way to do this. And, I've got to take charge here, and this person, is lower down in the hierarchy than me, and I've got to make sure that that person does their job, and whatever the concern is. But it's a setup for an abuse of power. The opposite is when you believe that people are equal in dignity, but perhaps differ in status. But if you believe everybody has a right to be treated as if they matter and be treated with these 10 elements like I've described, that's a very different understanding of power. And I think when you understand dignity and that everybody is equal in dignity, power is used very differently. And I have a colleague, Camilo Escarate, who has blown my mind with this quote, and I'll tell you what he said. Uh-huh. He said, any power that is not used in the service of human dignity is illegitimate.
How nice.
Any power that is not used in the service of human dignity is illegitimate. So this is why he's part of my team, where we think about dignity leadership as someone who understands that there is no rank order of dignity in the world. Everybody has dignity and needs to be treated that way. And you use your power very differently when you're thinking about, whoa, my leadership style really needs to preserve and protect the dignity of my people, the people whom I'm leading. That's a very different consciousness.
That's a revolutionary thought, I must say. It's very well put. Thank you for sharing that with us. You talked a little while ago about William James' concept of the I and the me. And in your book, you say that a healthy individual is someone who has integrated the I and the me. How can one integrate the I and the me?
Well, here's the thing. One of the things that I feel strongly about is that we humans, we need to develop a big dose of compassion for ourselves, because we do have this struggle between the I and the me. The me gets triggered all the time if somebody comes at us and we're afraid our dignity is going to be threatened, or even worse, maybe not worse, but we're afraid we'll be physically threatened. Mm-hmm. That's a real part of who we are. We do not want it to dominate our consciousness, but we also want to be extremely aware of the fact that we have choices about how we want to behave. And it's hard. It's hard overcoming those biological instincts, those self-preservation instincts, but we have the capacity as humans to do that. And the first stage of reconciliation in any failed relationship is reconciling inside yourself, your I and your me. It's like you want to integrate those two, because you don't want to banish your me from your consciousness, because it's part of being human. It's part of what E.O. Wilson says the human struggle is. So we just want to be able to calm down that me. So if we are reconciled with that part of ourselves, and if we integrate it into our core of compassion for ourselves, we won't get upset with ourselves if we, find ourselves, getting lured by one of those temptations, for example. We'll know how to nurture ourselves. And before we can nurture anybody else, we have to know how to have that compassion and make that connection inside us. Because we can look at somebody else who's gone off and gone crazy, and we can say to them, boy, there but for the grace of God go I. I know what that's like. And until we have that deep self-compassion, we never be able to extend that or empathy or any of those wonderful social reactions that we all want to learn and become good at. We'll never be able to do it. So we have to start with ourselves.
Interesting. Let's now move on to the 10 temptations to violate dignity. We've talked about this briefly. I am interested in finding out how you arrived at these 10 temptations. Was it based on your observation of conflicts? How did you come up with this list of 10 temptations?
Well, I read a lot of that literature in evolutionary psychology. A lot of them came out of a book by Jerome Barco. He wrote Darwin for Social Scientists, Missing the Revolution. He was the one who said, until we get these instincts, these self-preservation instincts under control, we have to control them before they control us. That's our challenge, because they're there, you know, the lure of this temptation to take the bait, to try to save face when, let's say, you know, we're both professors, so we both teach. And what if we make a huge mistake in our class when we, you know, talking about something, we just really make a big mistake. Typically what happens is our self-preservation instincts want us to cover it up. We don't want to admit, we don't want to make ourselves that vulnerable and say, oh, I made a big mistake. It's hard to do that when you're in a position of authority, especially, but it's hard to do it in any case. So anyway, these things I came up with by reading all of this literature, E.O. Wilson, there's plenty of them, the references are there in my book. But, you know, and then I started observing them, like you said, you know, but the thought of the specific instincts, they came to me from reading all that. And gossiping is such an important one. Yeah. You know, your last one, because what happened is back in, you know, 200,000 years ago, when what E.O. Wilson calls these internal mental architecture got developed in our brains, you know, these reactions, he said, there was no way of exchanging information 200,000 years ago. So people in the savannah, and that, you know, they had to resort to telling each other, especially about people who were causing trouble for the tribe, you know. So gossip was it became part of how we communicated danger, especially danger from other people. You know, I love that quote by Jean-Paul Sartre, that, you know, humans are, hell is other people. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like now we are each other's predators, you know.
Yes,
we don't have tigers on our tail, but we've got each other, you know, we are each other's predators. So anyway, that's where they came from.
Interesting. Now, you say that dignity is about 3 C's, connections, connections, and connections. Tell us more about that.
Well, you know, I've learned so much from so many people, and it's a long story, but I'll just make this one short. But I once had a student who told me that she felt that dignity, after listening to me go through all of the building blocks and everything, she told me, you know, I think I love what you've done here, Donna. Or Professor Hicks. She said, I love what you've done, but I think dignity is bigger than you think it is. I said, whoa, wow, what? Tell me, what do you mean it's bigger? Because I was talking about our individual dignity, you know, how we have to honor each other's dignity and all that. And she said, no, she said, we were given dignity as a sacred trust when we were born. And it's our duty to be the guardians of dignity in all of its forms, our own dignity, each other's dignity, and the dignity of something bigger than ourselves. You know, let people define what that is. Religious people can define it in terms of their creator or higher power, however they want to talk about it. But I also talk about that third C, something bigger than ourselves, as like a commitment to the greater good, a desire to have a purpose in life that contributes to the well-being of humanity. And so, but I let people define that however they want. But the first connection is to our own dignity. The second connection is to the dignity of others. And the third connection is the dignity of something greater. So it really, I mean, you can imagine how my students especially loved that concept, because it gave them a very clear sense of how all those things need to be in alignment if you want a fulfilled life. You know, if you have one of those out of whack, you're going to be unhappy, probably.
Interesting. Dr. Hicks, you point out in your book that our sense of self-worth evolves over a lifetime and goes through 3 phases. We begin with dependence, move on to independence, and then end up with interdependence. And you also say that not everyone gets to the final stage. Can you tell us about this? How does it work?
Well, you know, I think it's like how anything evolves in consciousness. You know, it takes time. Mm-hmm. And I think in the beginning, our awareness of our sense of worth, if you think of these little precious babies that come into our worlds when we have our children, you know, their dignity is dependent on us taking good care, not only good care of their physical needs, but of their dignity needs as well. So they need to see us treat them like there's something of value and of worth. And because everything comes through actions when you're little, when you're a child, but then eventually you realize that, okay, yeah, I've got dignity. I have my sense of worth. And you get, you have this great sense of independence. This is when individuation is flourishing during those adolescent years and early adulthood.
Right.
Then there comes a point, though, that we realize, my gosh, I have blind spots as a human being. I know I get myself into trouble. I mean, you just ask my husband, he'll tell you. I get myself into trouble because I'm not seeing the ways in which I'm negatively affecting him. And I can only see those blind spots if somebody helps me see them. If, like Professor Rao, you say to me, oh, Donna, I saw you interacting with your husband yesterday, and I think you just violated his dignity, when you were making a joke about him, But we need other people to help us grow and to evolve in that consciousness about how well we do when we treat each other, in relationships. What we need to be able to accept feedback from other people, because everybody else can see our blind spots except for us. So when we, especially in a work environment, my goodness, we need to, I have a whole chapter in my book about giving and receiving feedback and how to do it skillfully.
Indeed. One thing that you mentioned in your book, which I found very interesting, concerns vulnerability. You say that part of honoring dignity involves giving people the space to be vulnerable. Tell us more about that. What do you mean by giving people the space to be vulnerable?
Yes, well, so for example, I was talking about how easily we try to save face when we make a mistake. Mm-hmm. Let's say we're running a group of, we have a staff of 6 or 8 people. I'm the leader, and I'm trying to, as a good dignity leader, I'm trying to show my people what it looks like to be able to not resort to face saving, but to actually own up and take responsibility for the mistake that you made. Now that is very, very vulnerable. Most people, and as I said earlier, most people in positions of power do not like to show that vulnerability because they think, oh, I'm going to look weak, or they're not going to, respect me if I'm vulnerable. But the fact is just the opposite. All of the psychological research shows that when you, as a leader who are in a position of authority, actually make yourself vulnerable, not only do the people not judge you negatively, your team will will develop an empathy for you. We have this hardwired capacity for empathy too. And because they say to themselves, oh my gosh, if he can do this, if he can make himself that vulnerable and say, look, I really messed up and I'm so sorry. It had a negative effect on all of you. And I just want you to know that I'm going to work really hard at not doing that again. You know, that kind of vulnerability, talk about the command and control types of leadership.
Yeah.
You don't see that. It's the opposite, because you want to look strong and powerful and that you can never make any mistakes. Well, and you know, and here's the beauty of creating safe spaces for people to be vulnerable. The beauty is that that's how trust develops.
Interesting.
Yes, because if you model that, if you show them, if you set the tone in your work environment and show people, hey, it's okay, it's safe to be vulnerable. You can tell me when you made a mistake. Don't worry, I'm not gonna, give you a poor performance review or whatever. I want you to tell me. I want you to say, oh no, I know in that last project I was supposed to do X, Y, and Z, and I only did X and Y, and I forgot Z. Well, okay, and and I always use this quote by Thomas Edison when somebody told him about how many mistakes he made before he came up with the light bulb, right? He was the guy who did the light bulb. Mm-hmm. And he said to this critic, he said, I never made a mistake. I just figured out what I needed to learn. That's all. I didn't make mistakes. Now I know what doesn't work, he said.
Yeah.
So,
right.
It's this mindset of making people not afraid, because fear-based environments, that's where toxicity grows, is out of fear. You used that word earlier. So yeah, creating safe spaces for people to really say what's on their mind, giving them that opportunity to be their authentic selves, not the self. Well, there's another thing from my book that I quoted one of my colleagues, Bob Keegan, who said, most people feel like they have two jobs. One job is the job that they were hired to do, but the second job is to cover up feeling incompetent.
Interesting.
I love that. There's no safety there. There's no safety for people to be vulnerable there if they feel like they have to cover up all the time and afraid that, that they're going to be negatively judged. And right. All mistakes are opportunities for learning. Let's just put it that way.
Absolutely. Now, you talked about empathy in relationships, and I will come to that momentarily. It's very important. But let me ask you a quick follow-up question on vulnerability. You mentioned the vulnerability inventory. What is it, and how does one draw this inventory of vulnerability?
Oh, the vulnerability inventory. Yeah. Okay, so what that is, I ask people to take those 10 elements of dignity. I hand them out. Like, say I'm doing a workshop with people, and I want them to know what their soft spots are. Where people can maybe re-trigger an old element of dignity that's been violated early on in your life. Let's say you had a father who was very harsh, very critical, and was constantly berating you for something that you were doing wrong. Well, that kind of dignity wound, I would say that that's a wound to a person feeling safe. That's a safety violation. And if you have a background of growing up in that kind of unsafe environment, then you're going to be on the alert all the time for people coming at you. And that really messes up our relationships, because you don't trust anybody, because you think they're going to criticize you or harm you or hurt you. So that vulnerability inventory, you take each of those 10 elements. Now, for example, I have a lot of, people of color, my students, who come to me and say, well, boy, I have a long history of being discriminated against because of my race or because of my religion or whatever. And I want them to know that they are vulnerable in that element of dignity, that's going to be that's a wound even that may not even be healed yet. So if somebody comes and treats you as less than, when you have this history of, let's say in school growing up and being treated as if just because you're from a different race or an ethnicity or a religion, whatever, that you are going to be hyper vigilant when it comes to know. So I have people go through all those 10 elements. And just so that, again, this is all about self-knowledge, Dr. Rao. This is all about understanding ourselves as individuals and understanding ourselves in that broader sense of being part of the human species as Homo sapiens. Because we have a lot of similarities when it comes to this kind of vulnerability.
Interesting. You mentioned empathy as a significant element in social relationships. Let's talk about that. You say that restoring our primal sense of empathy is central to social adjustment. The question, however, is how does one acquire or cultivate this sense of empathy? What is one supposed to do?
So what I do and what I learned very early on in my conflict resolution practice was that when people get into conflict, the first thing that flies out the window is empathy.
Yeah.
It's just an observation that I have seen everywhere, not only in those big relationships internationally, but in my family, in schools, everywhere people converge. When conflict erupts, just think about it. I mean, you say things to other people that you would never say because you want to hurt them. There's part of you that self-preservation instinct, the taking the bait, you want to return the harm. But this is part of that other consciousness, right? That's part of the me consciousness that we want to be able to control. So, but that, yeah, it creates havoc when it comes to empathy because the empathy is what holds relationships together. People are feeling each other's reactions and you don't want to hurt other people's feelings. You don't want to violate their dignity because you know it hurts. And empathy is that glue that keeps those connections from going off the rails. And so when you learn to honor somebody's dignity, let's say you had a bad relationship with someone and that empathy is gone and you want to restore it. Well, what I have found in all these years of doing these encounters between, warring parties and so on, what I've discovered is that if you let people tell their story, sit them down face to face, let them tell their story about what it was like to live through the experiences of humiliation and that these dignity violations have created for them. If you give them that opportunity, and the other person who is the person who wants to restore the empathy, they have to sit there and be quiet. They can't challenge the person. So this we're talking very simple process of giving people an opportunity to tell their story about how they felt violated by the other side. And, that doesn't sound like very fancy or sophisticated methodology, but boy, I'll tell you, it really works. So if you can, this is why mediators are so successful, because they enable people to be able to tell those stories and talk about safety, creating safety. You need, and that's why mediation is so important, because you do need someone there to ensure that you're going to be okay, even if you tell this story. So this is why the field of mediation is so critical. I think we need, there's a whole branch of divorce legal system of divorce. They call it collaborative law, where they call it divorcing with dignity, to keep that dignity intact, even when you're in a struggle with somebody. How do you do that? And learning what it looks like to be a good listener, to try to feel the experiences that the other people are explaining. It's very sophisticated relationship repair. That's what it is, restoration of empathy.
I do use divorcing with dignity in my own practice as a family law attorney.
Oh, you know the collaborative lawyers.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very central and very powerful, I might add.
Yes.
Now, let's move on to something very interesting you propose in your book. You talk about the importance of dignity education, and you say that it is essential for creating a culture of dignity, particularly in organizations, and you also advocate a dignity pledge for all employees. Tell us more about dignity education and how it works.
So when I go into an organization that has a history of toxic culture and relationships where there's lots of conflicts, the first thing I do, first I work with the leadership team, because the leaders, as I said earlier, they have to set the tone. They have to show people what it looks like to lead with dignity. And then, but I don't stop at that. I tell the people, look, you have to educate your entire staff here, everybody. I mean, I've worked with a corporation as big as like 70,000 people, and we had this dignity program. All the employees got trained in those basic building blocks that we talked about earlier. They know the difference between dignity and respect. They understand the neuroscience. They know the element. Everybody in an organization has to sign on to learning this. And, you know, I have lots of help with this. I have people inside the organization that work with, you know, to do it. And then at the end, people come up with what's called, I call a dignity pledge. Some people call it a commitment to dignity. I like it when people, I mean, I call it a pledge, but it's really nice if, like this one client I had called it their dignity commitment document. And they come up with it themselves, with their leadership team and their people, both, because everybody now at this point knows the basic building blocks of dignity, and they agree to all of them being the guidelines for their relationships at work. So yeah, and the thing about the pledge is, let's just say, I mean, because there's always going to be conflicts. It's not like this work avoids conflict. It just shows you how to repair a relationship in a way where people's dignity is still intact. So that's what the pledge does. It says, hey, look, you know, you violated my dignity, but we have made a commitment here. We have pledged to work it out if something goes wrong in our relationship. So they go through a process, you know, a dignity conflict resolution process. So that's what I mean by dignity education, where everybody has to sign on to and agree to abide by treating each other with dignity.
In the very little time we have left, Dr. Hicks, let me ask you one final question. You say that to move from rage to recognition to reconciliation requires letting go of the wounded part of our identity. But we all know that dignity wounds are deep and are hard to let go. What's the best way of doing this?
Well, first of all, you know, if you think about what I said earlier, that the brain doesn't know the difference between a wound to our dignity and a physical injury, we have to accept that those dignity wounds that we've experienced, and some of them are historical, some of them are passed down from generation to generation, that we have to accept that they're real and that they require healing just as much as if we have a physical injury, and that needs to be healed. We just have to develop that consciousness that, because most people would say, oh, just sweep that under the rug. You know, if it's anything psychological, it's not real anyway. It's all in your head. But we know it's real. We know, those of us who have dignity consciousness knows how real they are. And you have to work with someone with around that. Like what I do typically, I mean, it's what I've done with myself. And what I've done with people I've worked with is just give them the opportunity to tell their stories about what those wounds were like. And I actually think that to be able to do it in a group setting, you know, do you know this practice restorative justice? Are you familiar with
Indeed,
that? Yeah.
very much so.
I think they've done the most beautiful job because I've worked with a lot of them, and they've integrated, some of them have integrated dignity awareness into their process. And they use ways, you know, like the 10 elements of dignity to talk about what those wounds were like and how they got those wounds. So, you know, it's this idea that only a clean wound heals. And, you know, the other thing that Archbishop Tutu taught me was that people, when they have experienced really terrible things, they need acknowledgement for the suffering that they've endured. They need acknowledgement. So setting up processes where you can have, like here in this country with race relations, we need a council set up, some kind of a council where people can be acknowledged for the suffering that they've endured. It's the only thing that worked in South Africa. And he was, bless his soul, was absolutely convinced that people needed to be able to talk about ways in which they've suffered. And that, once you get the acknowledgement for that, it frees you up. It like takes that pain from in here out into the external world. It removes the pain. But you can't do it. You have to have a process. Yeah. You have to have some way of healing those inner wounds.
We are completely out of time, Dr. Hicks. Thank you so much for your insights and for sharing your stories with us. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you once again.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Ideas and Insights. Thanks for joining us today. Next week, we will discuss a new book by Dr. Avram Alpert, The Good Enough Life, published by Princeton University Press this year. In this book, the author, Dr. Alpert, offers a radically novel blueprint for what he calls the good enough life for organizing our individual and collective lives. He says, a good enough life is a sustainable life that fosters interdependence, inclusion, and empathy. Dr. Alpert argues that individuals can flourish without the burdens of perfection and lead meaningful lives by focusing less on getting the best for themselves and more on becoming the kind of people who can participate in a good enough world. Join us next week for an exciting discussion with Dr. Avram Alpert. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.